Welcome to this UCPath online training. Updating position level funding is done on the funding entry page. The page is effective dated, so you can see the history of the position's funding through each fiscal year. The most current effective date is on the top for each record based on the position. The page allows for effective sequencing. If you have two records that are entered on the same date, the effective sequencing shows which record was entered first. It is therefore okay to make more than one update on the same effective date. When the funding of the position is changing, or if there is an additional pay being added to the position, a position funding update needs to be entered. If you are changing from fiscal year to fiscal year, but the funding has not changed, it rolls over. No funding entry is needed to go from fiscal year to fiscal year. Let's begin by selecting the PeopleSoft menu. From here, you could continue to navigate through this menu, but we are going to use the UCPath Work Center. Once you are in the Work Center, if you have set the funding entry page as a favorite, or visited it recently, you will see it in your Favorites menu. If not, you can navigate through the main menu, select Setup HCM, Product Related, Commitment Accounting, UC Customizations, and then Funding Entry. If this is a page that you will be using on a regular basis, you could click Add to Favorites up here in the top right corner to add it to your favorites. This will give you the opportunity to name it whatever is best for you and then click OK. You are always going to click Add a New Value to add or update funding, because Find an Existing Value will only show a read-only screen of current funding. The request ID will default to New, and the set ID should default to BKCMP. Enter the department, position pool ID if applicable, and the position number. If you are unsure of a field, you can use the magnifying glass to search for any of these fields. In this case, I'm going to enter funding for a position in the Best region. You can click the magnifying glass or just enter the department. Notice I didn't enter anything into the position pool ID. Here at Berkeley, the position pool funding option and the position pool ID are used by the Work Study office. So unless it is a work study position, we are going to leave that alone. The position number is 401-99729. Once all these funds are entered, then click Add. Before you enter anything, you can review the level of funding. Here we are looking at the position level. You can also review the job data snapshot. Here we're looking at a position that does not currently have an incumbent. You can also see the earnings distribution that is there. When you scroll to the right, you can see the different position funding that is on this position. If you click View All, it will show both of these funding rows vertically instead of needing to click between the pages. These rows are based on the effective dates of the funding, not the date that the transactions were entered. There are two funding entries for this position. The first one was effective 7/1/2020, and the second one was effective on 8/1/2020. You can see that currently we have a new request ID because we haven't saved the transaction yet. Notice the request ID hasn't been populated by the system yet. Once you hit Save, the request ID that populates is the same as the transaction number. It is a good idea to keep a record of the transactions that you have submitted so you can review their statuses later. You can see the information for the position, the set ID, department, fiscal year, and the budget begin and end date. The request status is in progress. The page here allows for effective sequencing, so if I needed to change something about the most recent funding entry, I could add funding entry by clicking the plus above that funding entry. I could make the funding effective date 8/1/2020, which would then increase the funding effective sequence to 1. Because when the system is looking at funding, it will look at the most recent funding date and the highest effective sequence and disregard any previously entered funding. If I wanted to change the funding entry between these two rows, such as a funding entry effective 7/15/2020, it is important to select the plus button above the 7/1/2020 row so that the funding entry rows will continue to be in chronological order based on the effective date. There is a plus above each of the funding entries. If I needed to update the funding entry historically, I would just click the plus above the funding entry that I would like to add the row before. This will make the row editable, and then I can adjust the position funding as needed. First, enter the effective date, 7/15/2020. So it is between the two rows. Notice the 8/1/2020 funding is above the row, and the 7/1/2020 row is after this new row. In this example, I'm going to use the minus to take a row away and make the funding 100% on the initial chart string. Keep in mind the pages are chronologically ordered, not by the date the transaction was entered, but by the effective date of the funding and the effective sequence. Click Save Now to save the transaction and check the entry for errors. You will notice there is now a request ID. This transaction now has its own transaction ID. If I am comfortable with this and want to make the change, I can attach any needed attachments and include any needed notes for the approver before clicking Submit. If I no longer want to complete the transaction, I need to click the Cancel button to unsave the transaction. Please keep in mind, for historical funding changes, which means you are changing funding for a past date, when the approver opens the page to approve, they will see the funding with the most recent effective date and the highest effective sequence. It is important to let the approver know what the transaction effective date is so that they can toggle back to the appropriate funding row that needs approval, in addition to reason why this funding was updated. One other thing to keep in mind is that if the incumbent has already been paid from the previous chart string, changing the funding historically won't reverse anything related to past pay. In these situations, not only does the funding need to be updated to indicate the correct chart strings, but direct retro transactions will need to be entered to transfer money from the new fund to the fund that originally paid the employee. Check the payroll calendar to see how many payrolls have happened since the historical date, so you know what needs to be processed as a direct retro. This is a great reason to do these transactions immediately, because the longer the time span, the more direct retro transactions will most likely need to be processed. Notice that it has skipped me as an approver because you cannot approve your own transactions. Though the system emails all potential approvers, be sure to follow your area's business process to notify your specific approver, usually via email or through ServiceNow. Thank you for watching this microlearning training video. If you have further questions, please review the materials available on the Berkeley UC Path Transactional User Training page, or email us at ucb.ucpath@berkeley.edu.